Hey guys, this is Isaac from Contender Bicycles, and here with me today is the Scott Patron eRIDE, and we have the chance to ride it out on this beautiful trail, give you a ride review, and also tell you a little bit about the more in-depth tech details. This bike, Scott classifies as their trail e-bike. It is paired with 160 millimeters of travel front and rear on a Fox 38, and it is a little bit on the heavier side. It has a 750 watt-hour battery with the Bosch CX system, putting out 85 newton meters of torque. So it is a through and through e-bike. Lots of power, lots of battery life, lots of torque. It's super, super fun. It rips you around the trails, and it's great for getting to the top of those long climbs. This bike itself also features an internal rear shock, which is we've now seen a lot of Scott bikes like their Genius and Spark ever since they acquired Bold Cycles a couple years ago. And then they have it spec with the Shimano XT drivetrain. This is really awesome on an e-bike because that Hyperglide system on the Shimano XT really lets you shift underneath power, similar to the SRAM transmission. To start off with on this Patron, it was very easy to set up before you ride. The sag measurements are written on the side of the frame so you can sit on top of the bike and see where your sag is sitting when you're on top of it instead of needing to get off and look at an O-ring, which makes things super easy for setting up your suspension before you get out on the trails. That was a nice touch to see from Scott, especially considering that the shock is internalized in the rear frame. Moving on from setup to cockpit setup, when I was looking at it before I ride, that is one thing about this bike which might not be to your liking, is that the cockpit on this is a little jumbled. On the left side, you have your dropper post, your twin lock levers for the fork and rear shock, and then you also have the Bosch's control system for the e-bike motors and batteries itself. That is a lot to control with one thumb on your left side, but at the same time, it means this bike has a ton of features that makes it super, super capable. So it's kind of a pro and a con there. It also features the display on the middle of it, which is very easy to ride, so easy to look at while you're riding, I notice. It's easier to see, like you can switch between battery life, speed, battery range that is left, and all those things. And it is super easy to look at when riding, which is something that not all e-bikes can claim. A lot of e-bikes use a very small display, maybe something like right there. That is a lot harder to ride while you are reading, and Scott killed it on this, making it super easy to read while riding. To go on from there, this bike is pretty big. It weighs over 50 pounds and it feels that way. When you have the motor off and you are trying to climb, it feels heavy. You are kind of slugging it out. But with the 4 modes that Bosch provides for you, you can put it into your Eco mode, your e-mountain bike plus mode, or boost, whatever you want to do, and it feels great. You can power up those fire roads, get it to your favorite trailhead, and it works really, really well. It's a pretty crazy sensation knowing how fast this thing is when you're on a single track trail that previously you had only ever done on an analog bike. The one thing about that e-system that I will say is that it is zippier than almost any other e-bike I have tried. It feels like a full-on e-bike, especially in the top mode. You put some power into the pedals and it jumps a little bit. It's got the torque, it's got the power, and it wants to go fast. The Eco mode, for reference, is also what I really like to descend in. I'm not a huge fan of descending in that really, really powerful mode because I feel like if you accidentally put power on the cranks when you're like in a corner, it tries to spit you out the other side, and if you're used to not riding an e-bike, that can kind of take you off guard. So I did descend mostly either all the way off or in Eco, but it still felt fairly good doing so. As a big bike, most people would assume that when descending, these bikes are either hard to corner, to jump, things like that. And while that's kind of true, it's not to the extent you think it is. Obviously it's a heavy bike, but as soon as it got moving, I was thoroughly impressed on how easy it was to maneuver. With a couple of gaps and corners, it was easy to throw over jumps, it was easy to once it got moving, it was pretty easy to make it fly through the air. It feels heavy like when it's still, for sure, and when you don't have the motor on, but once you're descending and the bike is moving at a decent pace, it does not feel nearly as heavy as you would think it feels. It was easy to flick around, it was really, really fun. And honestly, I think it corners better than a lot of my analog bikes. One of the reasons being is the motor in the Bosch CX system is centered low down on the bike, so that center of gravity of the bike is lower. So when cornering, it feels like you're sticking yourself to the wall, which is really, really awesome, and it feels pretty fantastic. One of the things I would also know about cornering on this bike is Scott specs this with a 2.6 Maxxis dissector front and rear, which for tire choice in the rear is great. The dissector is an amazing rear tire, but on the front, I'm not a huge fan of it on this bike. This bike is 160 millimeters of travel and it wants you to push it hard. And the dissector does not have as much tread as I would like on the front tire. The dissector also has a pretty distinctive gap in between its center knobs and its cornering knobs, which means the transition in a corner can kind of slip out and it can make the rider feel uneasy or not 100% sure when their tire is gonna hook. If they ran, let's say like a DHF in the same size on the front of this, I think it would feel a lot better. That's more like a personal nitpick. I'm very picky about my tires, but I was not the biggest fan of the dissector on the front of this bike. Felt great in the rear, but maybe something a little bit more aggressive up front. This bike, they use 200 millimeter rotors front and rear with the Shimano XTD or 4 pistons, which feel great. Tons of stopping power, super bitey. At the end of a long descent on this bike, I was noticing, however, that the heat that this bike produces, being as big as it is, did cause the rotors to rub a little bit. After the rotors cooled off, that rubbing sensation will go away. I have not ridden a ton of bikes this size and e-bikes this big, so it's possible that's just an e-bike thing in general. You know, they weigh that much, they cause a lot of friction to happen between those rotors, and those rotors and brake pads heat up and they might rub. That could just be an e-bike thing in general, but it did go away as soon as they cooled off. It was not like a problem that just stayed around every time you descended. It would go away as soon as the rotors cooled off. They use the Shimano Hyperglide system on this, which I was super a big fan of, because the Hyperglide system lets you pedal underneath power way better, which is awesome because on an e-bike you're climbing, you're not thinking about how you're just spinning up at 17 miles per hour and blasting up a hill in your top mode. So you're shifting, it actually shifts and it carries with you and it doesn't misshift, it doesn't clang and ping everywhere as it would on a normal drivetrain, which is really awesome. Overall, the Patron is an incredibly fun bike. It's super zippy, it's super awesome. It was great for recovery days when I had a big ride the next day or had a big ride the day before. It let me do after work laps super easily, and it is a zippy, fun bike. If you have any questions about the Patron or want to try one out for yourself, feel free to visit us in store in Salt Lake or in Park City, or visit us online at contenderbicycles.com.